I picked up a jar of molasses, and the first thing I noticed was that it did not look appealing at all. Dark, thick, sticky, slow-moving, looking more like a forgotten byproduct than a prized kitchen ingredient. In modern sugar production, the bright sugar crystals are usually treated as the main product, while the dark liquid left after the sugar is separated can easily be seen as a byproduct. But that dark liquid still carries deep flavor, rich color, and some of the minerals from sugarcane juice. A rough-looking ingredient is not the same as a worthless one. On many rural farms and in some Amish communities, jars of dark molasses are still a familiar sweetener. Depending on where they live, families may cook it down from sugarcane or sorghum. In this video, I will walk through what molasses really is, why older generations kept using it, and how to put it to work without turning the garden into an ant magnet. What is molasses, really? The journey of molasses begins with sugarcane. People press the cane stalks to get the sweet juice inside, then cook that juice for a long time so the water slowly evaporates and sugar crystals begin to form. After those sugar crystals are removed, the dark liquid left behind keeps getting cooked down. That thick, sticky, very dark brown liquid becomes what we call molasses. Put simply, white sugar is the part that gets taken out, cleaned up and refined until it looks lighter. Molasses keeps the darker color, the deeper flavor, and some of the minerals that remain in the cane juice after the sugar is separated. Molasses is not a syrup that gets colored to look darker. It forms directly when sugarcane juice is cooked, sugar crystals are removed, and the concentrated liquid is kept. How are light, dark, and blackstrap molasses different? Molasses changes depending on how many times the cane juice is cooked and how much sugar is removed. The later the processing stage, the darker, thicker, less gently sweet, and stronger tasting the molasses usually becomes. The mildest type is light molasses. This is usually the molasses from the first stage. It has a lighter color, a gentler sweetness, and works well in cakes, sauces, or recipes where you do not want a heavy molasses flavor. Next is dark molasses. This type is deeper in color, richer in taste, and more clearly molasses-like, which makes it a good fit for gingerbread, baked beans, or barbecue sauce that needs a warm flavor and a dark brown color. The strongest one is blackstrap molasses. It is thick, almost black, less sweet, and slightly bitter. People often talk about it because it contains more minerals, but that does not mean it tastes better or belongs in every recipe. Choosing the right molasses isn't just about grabbing the first dark jar you see on the shelf. You need to know whether it is light, dark, or blackstrap, because each one serves a completely different purpose in the kitchen and around the homestead. Why molasses still has a place in Amish homes and homesteads. If you ask an American who grew up in the countryside about molasses, they probably will not talk about minerals first. They are more likely to remember the smell of hot biscuits, melting butter, and dark molasses poured over breakfast. In other families, that memory lives in pancakes, hot cornbread, gingerbread, or molasses cookie recipes passed down from grandparents. Molasses enters memory before it enters any explanation. In Pennsylvania, Dutch country, molasses is also tied to shoofly pie, the famous pie with a rich, sweet filling and crumb topping. Just mentioning its name instantly brings an Amish kitchen to mind. For some Amish and homestead families, molasses is not a cheap stand-in for white sugar. It is the flavor of harvest season, home-cooked food, and a way of living that makes use of what the land provides. From the kitchen, that jar can also make its way into compost, bokashi, and a few small jobs around the farm. But its most familiar use still begins with baking, brown sugar, and family meals. Making brown sugar and keeping baked goods soft. The first use is simple. Put molasses back into white sugar. I add about 1 cup of white sugar to a bowl, then drizzle about 1 tablespoon of molasses over it. At first, the molasses leaves dark streaks through the sugar. But as I press and mix it well, the whole batch slowly turns brown, softer, moister, and more fragrant. In many cases, brown sugar is simply white sugar with molasses mixed back in for color, flavor, and moisture. If I want a darker color, I add just a little more at a time so the sugar does not get too wet. The second use is in baking. Molasses gives gingerbread, molasses cookies, biscuits, sweetbreads, and Pennsylvania Dutch chouflée pie that deep brown color and warm flavor. Molasses also helps baked goods hold moisture better, so they often stay soft longer and do not dry out as quickly. That makes it especially useful for gingerbread, soft cookies, or recipes that need to keep their texture for a few days. The smell of molasses mixed with butter, ginger, or cinnamon is hard to miss. That is why so many people remember molasses through family baking, not through a textbook definition of an ingredient. If I am just starting to bake with molasses, I would choose light molasses or dark molasses. Blackstrap is thicker, less sweet, and noticeably bitter, so it only fits when the recipe truly needs that strong flavor. With just these two uses, molasses already earns its place in the kitchen. But around a homestead, a small amount of it can also show up in compost, bokashi, and a few soil care methods where the dose needs to be controlled carefully. Using it in compost and garden soil. Once molasses leaves the kitchen, it starts showing up in some composting and organic soil care practices. People only use a small amount because it is a helpful supplement, not a required ingredient in the compost pile. At first, that sounds a little strange because plants do not need to be fed sugar. The goal here is to give an easy food source to some of the microbes breaking down organic material in the pile. If I use molasses, I dilute it and mix it well into the compost. It does not replace dry leaves, green material, moisture, or air. A balanced compost pile still has to stand on those proven basics. I also do not leave a sweet liquid sitting exposed on the surface. After mixing, I cover it back up with dry leaves, straw, or carbon-rich material to keep the sweet smell from drawing ants and insects in. Outside compost, some families have their own old mixtures for tomatoes or vegetable beds. I have heard of people mixing molasses with rainwater, wood ash, and yeast as a family practice passed down over time. I treat that as experience worth noting, not as a universal recipe for every garden. Ash can change soil pH, and too much molasses can create smells and attract ants without making the plants any healthier. With folk-style garden recipes, the safest rule is to test a small corner first. Do not pour a whole jar into the bed, otherwise, the only thing you'll end up growing is a massive ant colony right under your plants. Long-time homesteaders usually stick to the proven basics: loose soil, balanced compost, enough moisture, and steady care. Molasses only gets added when they have a clear reason to use it. Bokashi and rusty tools. After compost and garden soil, I also see molasses show up in a job many homesteaders know well: bokashi. This is a way of fermenting kitchen scraps with microbes in a sealed bucket, so organic waste gets put to use instead of thrown away. In bokashi, molasses is often used as food for the microbes when preparing the starter or bokashi bran. It only helps when used in the right recipe and the right amount. Adding more does not automatically make it better. When I make bokashi, I keep the bucket sealed, wipe off any molasses stuck around the rim, and do not let sweet liquid leak out. After fermentation, the material still needs to be handled properly before it goes into the soil. Another use is soaking lightly rusted iron tools. Many people choose blackstrap molasses because it is cheap and concentrated. Then mix about 1 part molasses with 9 parts water in a lidded bucket. Tools may need to soak from a few days to a few weeks, depending on the rust and the temperature. I check them from time to time, scrub once the rust softens, Then rinse, dry, and oil the metal for protection. Because the liquid is still sweet, I do not leave the bucket open outside, and I do not let molasses smear around the sides. Keeping the lid on is the simple way to limit ants, insects, and contact from children or pets. This method takes time, but it's perfect for old iron farm tools and parts that are hard to scrub by hand. I avoid using it directly on anything with paint, wood, or surfaces that need high precision. But once molasses comes out into the garden, one practical question follows. How do I make use of it without accidentally turning the garden into a place that attracts ants and insects? Why can molasses draw ants into the garden? After looking into different ways to use molasses in the garden, I have found that sometimes the best move is to leave the jar in the kitchen. Not every garden needs an extra source of sugar added to the soil or compost. If the soil is already too wet, smells sour, or drains poorly, I do not add molasses. The problem at that point is air and soil structure, so adding something sweet only makes things harder to manage. I also avoid using it when there are already plenty of ants, flies, or sweet-loving insects around the beds. An area that already attracts them does not need another sugary smell. With raw-eating greens or crops close to harvest, I am even more careful. I do not want to put an uncontrolled microbial mix on the part of the plant that will be picked and eaten soon. If the compost pile is still cold, dry, or out of balance, molasses will not fix the root problem. I check the greens, browns, moisture, and airflow before thinking about any add-on. Compacted soil, low organic matter, or waterlogging needs more direct fixes like adding compost, improving drainage, or cutting back on watering. A spoonful of molasses cannot replace those jobs. The rule I use is simple. Only add molasses when I know exactly what process I am trying to support. If the only reason is that an online tip sounds clever, I skip it. Looked at that way, molasses still has a place in the homestead, but it does not need to show up in every garden bed. Knowing when not to use it can matter more than learning one more recipe. How I keep one jar of molasses usable for a long time. Molasses is not something I use every day. Because of that, I used to wonder whether an open jar would spoil quickly like some other syrups. What reassured me is that molasses is very high in sugar, so when it is stored properly, it can usually last quite a long time. What matters more is how I put it away after each use. After I scoop or pour out molasses, I always wipe the sticky rim clean and close the lid tightly. Even a thin layer left on the outside can harden, collect dust, or attract ants if insects are around. I usually keep the jar in a dry, cool place, away from direct sunlight. Many types of molasses do not have to be refrigerated after opening, but a steady temperature still helps the quality change less over time. If molasses sits for a long time, it can get thicker or harder to pour, especially in cold weather. That does not always mean it has gone bad. Sometimes I just let the sealed jar come back to room temperature, or set the outside of the jar in warm water for a bit so it flows more easily. What I watch more closely is the smell and the surface. If I see mold, notice an unusual fermented smell, or see a clear change from when the jar was first opened, I do not keep using it. For me, keeping one jar of molasses usable for a long time is not complicated. Keep it clean after each use, seal it well, and store it in the right place, and you can use it little by little in both the kitchen and the garden without opening a new jar too often. But no matter how well I store it, I have learned something more important. Molasses is only truly useful when I understand what job it should do, and when I know not to expect too much from it. What molasses cannot do. Longtime homesteaders often keep molasses on the shelf because they know where it helps. They also know there are days when the best thing to do is leave that jar in the pantry. In the garden, molasses does not replace fertilizer, and it cannot turn poor soil into rich soil after just a few uses. If the soil lacks organic matter, is compacted, or drains poorly, those problems still need fundamental fixes. It's a similar story in the kitchen. Molasses gives beautiful color, deep flavor, and helps many baked goods hold moisture better. But its strong taste does not fit every recipe. Choosing the right type and using the right amount matters more than pouring in extra. I also do not believe that a natural ingredient can be used without limits. Whether in food, compost, or the garden, too much usually throws things off instead of bringing better results. In some Amish families, every ingredient has a clear role. Molasses is used when they need deep flavor, moisture, or a sugar source for fermentation, and then they stop there. The value of a jar of molasses is not in how many tricks you can list. It is in choosing the right type, using just enough, and not letting one small trick replace time-tested principles that have worked for generations. So I do not see molasses as a secret fix for everything. It is only a humble ingredient, but it is worth keeping when you understand the right jobs for it. A jar of molasses holds more than sweetness. After all this, I no longer see molasses as just a dark, thick, old-fashioned syrup. It comes from the sugar-making process, but that leftover liquid still holds color, flavor, and a longer story than I once imagined. In the kitchen, it can make brown sugar, bring depth to baked goods, and bring back memories of hot biscuits, melting butter, or family gingerbread. In the garden, it can also play a small role in a few homestead practices when used in the right place and in the right amount. Many Amish and homestead families still keep molasses because it is tied to food they make themselves, recipes passed down over time, and a way of living with less waste. Its value comes from practical use, not from looking pretty. The next time I look at a dark, thick, sticky jar of molasses, I will not only see what is left after white sugar has been separated out. I will see an ingredient that has traveled from sugarcane, through the kitchen, out to the garden, and stayed with people because of its simple, everyday value.